Greetings. This is one of a series of videos on evaluation paradigm perspectives about the mental models that determine how we ask questions, what kind of answers we're looking for, and in this case we're going to look at definitive answers, the elusive search for definitive answers, for truth, for attribution, for conclusive evidence. It begins by trying to find that we've actually determined something for sure, that we've hit a bullseye of truth, creating knowledge. An example, a classic example, comes from the follow-through experiment that went on for a decade in the 1960s and 70s. Follow-through was an early childhood effort to prepare children for school. It followed on Head Start, and it was to help them be able to work well in basic skills and in appropriate social behaviors in school. It was the most extensive educational experiment ever conducted. It was charged with determining the best way of teaching at-risk children from kindergarten through grade 3. 22 different models of instruction were compared in the search for the best. Over 200,000 children in 178 communities were involved. The communities that implemented the different approaches spanned the full range of demographic variables, ethnic composition, and poverty level. And the very notion that undergirded follow-through experiment was there must be a best way. Of all these different models, of all these different approaches, of all the different ways people are going about educating children, surely one stands out as best. The result was there was actually more variation within models than between models. No model stood out as best. A similar experiment went on with the New Jersey negative income tax experiment, trying to find the level at which people could get benefits and still have an incentive to work. That there must be some moment, some precise level where people would still get support but be willing to stay in the job market. No such definitive, generalizable point was found. No significant impact on labor force participation, no significant changes in spending patterns, no significant changes in quality of life indicators. Indeed, there have been hundreds of these experiments in social justice, in housing, in education, in welfare, in income support, of all kinds of experiments trying to find the best way. It turns out to be an elusive search, but it is an idea that's hard to give up, that there must be a best way. In the American Journal of Evaluation in 2022, a major article on counterfactual definitions of program effects, defining the search for attribution. Counterfactual thinking is the notion that a program effect is the difference between what happened after the program was implemented and what would have happened if the program had not been implemented. This is an effort to think about and determine empirically what would have happened if a program had not been implemented. But of course, all kinds of things could have happened if a program had not been implemented, including other programs. And yet the search for attribution, for definitive connection between program implementation and outcomes, and the comparison to the null condition where nothing happened, is a powerful undergirding evaluation search. We get hierarchies of evidence where the gold standard is considered randomized controlled trials, searching for attribution and definitive answers. Michael Scriven's classic definition of evaluation as the process of determining the merit, worth, and value of things, has this same sense of definitiveness built into the definition. Merit is, does the program work? Worth is, does it work in a way that would be valuable in other places, that it ought to be scaled and generalized? And so merit and worth have this definitive quality to them. Much of evaluation then is directed at a search for models, formative models to create summative models that answer the question, does it work? Merit and worth are about what works and what can be generalized. The What Works Clearinghouse for 2 decades has been accumulating evidence about what works in education. Best practices are a major concern of our time. Winston Churchill famously said, "My tastes are simple. I am easily satisfied with the very best." And there again, there's this sense that there must be a best. And so best practices are everywhere. We hear people referring to best practices. This idea that there's a best way to do things is powerful, and yet it remains the evidence elusive. For something to be best, we'd have to know what all the options were, have tested all those options, and conclude that context doesn't matter. The search for definitive answers then includes looking for do's and don'ts. What can we do for sure? What shouldn't we do for sure? We rank things. We love ranking. Top 10 lists. There's a top 10 website, shows more than 200,000 top 10 lists looking for ranking the best. We give medals, gold, silver, and copper, to distinguish top from less best. Best practices are founded in the very origins of the Industrial Revolution. As manufacturing came into the world, Frederick Winslow Taylor was a proponent of what was called scientific management. Scientific management was a search for maximizing human productivity, what was called Taylorism. He conducted theory of time and motion studies to determine the best way to do a job. Taylor broke down each activity into very small motions and timed each motion with a stopwatch. He would then analyze the action to eliminate the unnecessary motion, which created the most efficient method of performing an assigned task. Each worker was trained to perform the task in exactly the same way, leading to an efficient operation that resulted in consistent quality and output. Thus, time and motion studies, Taylorism, scientific management led to standardization, productivity, and efficiency. Maximizing human potential. How should typewriter keys be arranged? How should assembly lines be arranged? Scientific management search for best practices and the criterion of productivity, standardization, and efficiency are still with us. The efficiency is one of the criteria of the widely used OECD DAC criteria. And so we carry with us this notion that we ought to be having the best, the most efficient ways of doing things. The agricultural revolution is scientifically based on a similar notion. The search for ways of increasing agricultural productivity led in the mid-1800s in the United States and elsewhere to experiment stations and agricultural extension programs to carry knowledge from those experiment stations to farmers. Statistics came out of this era. The statistics were developed in conjunction with trying to determine what were the most effective agricultural practices. Medical randomized control trials were introduced in 1923. The idea of randomization, and the first control trial in medicine was of streptomycin in pulmonary tuberculosis in 1946 in the UK. All of these efforts that impact evaluation looking for what works, what's the best way to do things. The International Initiative for Impact Evaluation is working so that policymakers and implementers can prioritize the most effective interventions. Therefore, they need to be equipped with the best available evidence to support their decision-making. Best evidence, best implementations, best solutions. And so experimental evaluation as a search for the best has been and remains a dominant approach, a dominant paradigm in evaluation. Spotlighted when Esther Duflo won the Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in 2019 for work on experimental evaluations around poverty alleviation. So this search for truth, what is true, what really works, what is best, is a core emphasis in much of evaluation. We search for definitive answers, for truth, for attribution, for summative evaluation. Does it work? For counterfactual logic, what would have happened without the program? A search for best practices, proven models, statistical significance, maximizing efficiency, what works for whom in what ways, and doing rankings. All of these things in search of definitive answers. And yet the alternative paradigms suggest that the elusiveness of definitive answers leads in other directions. And from truth, we move to perspective, from speaking truth to power to supporting dialogue, from best practices to contingent answers around options by context, from attribution analysis to contribution analysis, from summative evaluation to developmental evaluation and ongoing adaptation, from proven models to guiding principles, from maximizing to optimizing, from what works to how to adapt, from the gold standard to the platinum standard, which involves choosing the best and most appropriate methods for the context rather than having a hierarchy that places randomized controlled trials at the top. Definitive answers look for statistical significance. Contingent answers look for ambiguity, accept ambiguity. Thinking about what the statistical significance means, being open and modest. These principles that the American Statistical Association adopted in banning the term statistical significance because it is too mechanistic. Counterfactual logic as a definitive answer, and the contingent answer being systems mapping, system thinking, and mapping and complexity. And so we move from prescriptive models to guiding principles. As George Fox famously said, George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so we move from truth to utility in some cases, trying to figure out where can we actually have appropriate best practices, where can we find models that are proven and work in pharmaceuticals, in agriculture, but where human beings are concerned, the search for the best is proving elusive. The search for generalizable models for definitive answers is hard to find. We reach out, but it's not often quite there. And so evaluation panorama paradigm perspectives, the search for definitive answers continues. As elusive as it is, the idea that there are definitive answers, that there are best practices, that there must be a best way to do things, remains a powerful imperative for carrying out evaluation. That search for the center of all those different directions remains one of the most dominant paradigms in evaluation.